Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. President Čech, Secretary Albright, ministries, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you all at today's conference organized by recently established Aspen Institute Prague. To be honest, we were a little bit worried when we decided to organize this launch conference of Aspen Institute Prague on July 19th, in the middle of summer vacations. But looking around, I realized that there was really no need to be so afraid, probably mostly because of the names of people who will appear on the panel and because of the one name who will be here as a keynote speaker. So once again, thank you very much for hosting us, President Čech. Secretary Albright, thank you very much for coming and for helping with the establishment of Aspen Institute Prague. We really appreciate your help. Thanks to all the panelists for coming. And now let me introduce the first official speaker, who is the President of the Czech Senate, Mr. Milan Štěch. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Dámy a pánové, všichni vážení hosté, dovolte mi přivítat vás zde ve Valdštejnském paláci, sídle Senátu Parlamentu České republiky. Aspen Institute má své kořeny ve Spojených státech amerických a více jak 60letou tradici. Chápu je jako instituci šířící a podporující demokratické hodnoty, k čemuž přispívá organizováním řady setkání významných osobností, které svojí dosavadní prací získaly vysoké renomé. Formou zapojení osobností širokého politického, podnikatelského a občanského spektra a umožněním nelimitované diskuze jej považuji i za velice plnohodnotnou platformu k podpoře a rozvoji občanské společnosti. Zvláště jsem poctěn, že mohu zde mezi námi přivítat paní Madeleine Albrightovou, bývalou ministryni zahraničních věcí Spojených států amerických a nynější předsedkyni Albright Stonebridge Group, která má k Česku velmi blízký vztah, a to i díky českým kořenům své rodiny. Český senát, jehož hlavní úloha je z podstaty naší ústavy legislativní, jako jednu z forem posuzování navrhovaných zákonů a přípravy stanovisek využívá právě zapojení odborné i další veřejnosti. V Senátu se koná velké množství seminářů, konferencí a slyšení k různým aktuálním otázkám i k nadčasovým záležitostem. Český senát je otevřen jakékoliv diskuzi týkající se nejen legislativy, proto tedy horní komora Českého parlamentu dnes tak přispívá k zahájení činnosti Aspen Institutu v Praze. Téma dnešní konference je velmi aktuální. Krize jako příležitost, Evropa a Spojené státy americké v globalizovaném světě. Rád bych zmínil několik myšlenek, které by charakterizovaly můj postoj k tomuto tématu. Dnešní globalizovaný svět se během posledních 2 dekád rozvinul mnohem rychleji, než jsme si dokázali představit, a proto pokud budeme chtít adekvátně reagovat na současné výzvy, budeme muset stejně rychle jednat a uvědomit si, že jakékoliv řešení není jediné, není dostačující a není ani konečné. Současná provázanost dnešního světa je tak úzká, že není možné uvažovat že by se mohla vrátit zpět, samozřejmě, že nám tato provázanost, tedy globalizace, přináší užitek a zlepšuje miliardám lidí život, ale také má někdy negativní dopady, což se právě v současné krizi výrazně ukazuje a také důsledky mnoha lidem de facto komplikuje život. Aby bylo možné současnou krizi efektivně řešit, je potřeba nahlížet na euroatlantický prostor jako na celek a nedělit ho na Evropu a Spojené státy, či dokonce vydělovat z něj jednotlivé země. To k řešení krize nikterak nepomůže, ale spíš nám přitíží. Podle mého názoru se zatím nepodařilo objektivně a důsledně identifikovat hlavní příčiny vzniku současných finančních, hospodářských, následně i politických problémů. Bez tohoto nenajdeme účinná řešení. Osobně se domnívám, že nejvýstižněji příčiny současných problémů pojmenoval například ve svém vystoupení na sjezdu SPD v prosinci loňského roku Helmut Schmidt, bývalý předseda německé vlády. Bohužel se stává, že značná část dnešní společnosti se orientuje jen na materiální hodnoty a na honbu za ekonomickými statky a zisky a často zapomíná na základní hodnoty společnosti. Neměli bychom přehlížet, že právě tyto hodnoty a usilovná kvalitně odváděná práce vytvořily z amerického prostoru oblast stability a prosperity. Na mnoha jiných místech ve světě tomu tak není právě proto, že tam neuplatňují principy demokracie, lidských práv, neexistuje občanská společnost, je slabé sociální cítění a soudržnost společnosti. Přitom je potřeba si ale stále uvědomovat, že euroatlantický prostor není v dnešním globalizovaném světě izolovaný, ale musí počítat s dalšími významnými aktéry, zejména s dynamicky se rozvíjející Asií a Latinskou Amerikou. V závěru svého vystoupení, dámy a pánové, chci popřát pražské pobočce Aspen institutu mnoho úspěchů ve své činnosti. Osobně se rád v budoucnu zúčastním dalších jeho aktivit a pro nejbližší okamžiky vám všem přeji ještě jednou příjemný pobyt zde v prostorách Senátu a dobrý průběh dnešní konference.
Oh, I thought there would be more speeches. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Joffe. I'm running this panel, and I would like to introduce very briefly three people who don't need an introduction. They belong to my FFM club, my favorite former foreign ministers club. All three of them. The only one that's missing is Mr. Kozyrov, but you'll get to see him tomorrow. So on this, starting out from my side, Adam Rothfeld, who was foreign minister, but who all... That's not a matter of applause, just being foreign minister. Now, wait a minute, 5 more seconds. But his great career has been as a scholar running the Swedish Institute for Peace Research. Now, go ahead. Then there's Ana Palacio, also former foreign minister of Spain. Her real skill, however, is to prepare the best braised oxtail this side of Prague. Better even than the Habsburg version. But Spain was part of Habsburg too, right? And finally, Malcolm Rifkind, also former foreign minister, foreign secretary, who has excelled in one extraordinary way, I think, for anybody who knows Britain. He's actually a Scotsman. And he stood for election in Kensington, which is really England, London, England. And this Scotsman stood for election in an English district, and he won. So now he is a member of Parliament in London. Having introduced them, let me start with the first question. These people have graciously agreed not to have any statements, so we can go into the questions right away, if I can find them. The first question concerns the strategic shift that is said to be taking place, with the United States shifting from Europe to Asia. This is something that has been predicted every 10 years for the last 50 years. My first question is it really happening? And if so, why? Who would like to go first? Anna?
Well, thank you for just accepting a volunteer. Is it happening? Yes. I think that there is a big difference between both sides of the Atlantic. When you say in the United States, in front of any audience, that, United States is in decline, now the rising China, the rising East, there will be a body language of people being uncomfortable. And if the audience is a bit conservative, there will be someone that will say, absolutely not, and just be quite upset. So the difference is that if you make the same statement before a European audience, nobody will just bulge. And everybody, by the body language, will just make you understand that that we Europeans, we think that there is a decline going on in Europe. So with this first issue, of course, the pivot to Asia was of great concern. I remember the effort that the Obama administration made before the last Munich Security Conference by having everybody disembarking there and just to confirm that it was more a readjustment or refocusing, rebalancing, many things, but not a pivot. And to the surprise of our American friends, what the Europeans wanted, and I think that this is the essence of this issue, is to be part of it, that the Americans would not go solo to the East, that there would be a kind of a strategical agreement in going there. So, in summary, yes, it is happening. It's perceived in a different way, all in all, both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it would be sensible to approach it as a common goal.
Markham, is it happening? Is it happening?
Well,
yes.
Right. The question is whether there's a strategic change in America's priorities from Europe to Asia. In one sense, the answer is blindingly obvious. Of course there is. But many of the conclusions that are drawn from that, in my view, are wrong. First of all, it's obvious that America is spending more time with Asia. For the first 60 years after the Second World War, the biggest geopolitical problem the world faced was the Cold War, when both Europe and the United States faced or perceived a major threat to their very existence and liberty from the Soviet bloc. Europe is no longer a source of likely military conflict, with the one exception of Cyprus and the problems between Greece and Turkey. Pretty well the whole of Europe is peaceful. There are political problems, but none of them are likely to result in military conflict. When you look at Asia, it's the other way around. And of course America is an Atlantic, but also a Pacific country. Where are the most likely hotspots in the world? North Korea and South Korea, Taiwan and China, the Spratly Islands. Further to the west, India and Pakistan over Kashmir. If there are wars in the world, these are the most likely places they're going to be. So, yes, it is obvious that the United States is spending more time on these issues. However, I said that we draw the wrong conclusion from that. The conclusion is often that therefore the Western alliance of the United States, North America and Europe is somehow going to disintegrate. Absolutely not. Not only are they continuing to have shared values, but look what happens whenever there is a major political challenge which requires the United States, but the United States likes to have allies. And so at the moment, dealing with the problems of Iran, the United States is working very closely with France, the United Kingdom and the European Union. When you had a problem in Libya, the United States, United Kingdom and France were the three countries of the working very closely together. Afghanistan through the NATO structure. So the United States will continue to see Europe as that part of the world with which it shares most in common in terms of values, in terms of political strategy, and in one final point, military capability. And really I'm talking about the United Kingdom and France, because although they are much, much weaker than the United States, the United Kingdom still has the fourth largest defense budget in the world, and France much the same.
You're preempting another question. Let me just, because we're going to get to this, let me just, before formulating the next question, so the first question was, are they drifting apart? Yes. Anna says, yes, but they should have talked to us about it like you talk to a child whom you're about to abandon because you're getting divorced. They should have sat down with us. And you say it doesn't really matter because the core of the alliance is intact.
Well,
right?
I'm saying the relationship was bound to change once the Cold War was behind us.
Okay.
That's good news, not bad news.
So anyway, the answer is we agree on the shift and why. We should have talked about it, says Anna. You says, no, the Atlantic is okay. Adam.
But no, well, I want to make, not at all as a child. I think that this is a stereotype.
No, it was a joke.
But I think that we have to get rid of this stereotype. I think that what is clear, and anyone that has been in office, as foreign affairs minister knows, is that many times the United States goes because the United States takes its allies for granted. It's part of the personality of the United States, for granted in this move. And then they will come back and discuss, and I think that this is what happened, or this is how I perceive, and as I say, it was not just one, but Secretary Clinton and also the Secretary of Defense came to this and this is when they understood that what concerned Europe was not Europe, it was just going together, just preserving this transatlantic relationship once, as Malcolm is saying very well, once the Cold War is over. So,
Adam,
yeah.
you've heard enough from these old Europe.
Yep. I would like to
tell
say
me what New Europe says.
I do understand that your question was in fact provocative in intellectual sense. That know that shift of the American foreign and security policy from Europe and Atlantic to Pacific and Asia. It is not the question whether it is announced or not. It is fact of life. And this fact of life is for three reasons. Some of them were mentioned already by Anna and Malcolm. I would like to add one additional element, namely foreign policy and security policy is usually a function of the real threat and challenges. And these threats are not in Europe at the moment. They are somewhere else. In the Middle East, in Gulf, in Korean Peninsula, and to some extent, I would say, all the problems connected with the new role of China. In other words, one cannot ignore the new reality. China did not exist as a global power in this sense of security. Now it is not only the new emerging, it is already the new challenge for the United States and for many other nations. Now, I would like to say that as far as Europe is concerned, the problem is that Europe as entity is not prepared to take the responsibility which was taken by the United States in the past. And I would like to say, not because of the lack of concepts. In Europe, we have too many concepts. It is not the problem of new procedures, rules, etc. All of them are with us. The problem is that Europe does not digest properly that European Union is perceived as a new power, and it is not a new power. It is more than organization, but much less than power. And Malcolm, as a politician from the United Kingdom, he knows what I have in mind, that for the United Kingdom, Europe is not a power. It is a kind of the new type, a new animal in political life. It is not a global power comparable to the traditional powers as it was the United States or United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, and China.
Would the United States act differently if Europe were actually a strategic player, which Europe obviously isn't?
Yes. I suppose that if it is Europe, would be much more united, integrated, and will be really a new power, then the American approach to Europe will be a different one. I would like to say not only of the United States, it is also the problem of other powers in the world. For example, for Russia, who is a neighbor of the European Union, it is much easier to continue to cultivate the bilateral relations with traditional classical powers of the past, like United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, than with the European Union as an entity. In other words, we have a problem that Europe, it is unfinished business, but already the world and the whole international environment is not waiting for the end of this process, which in Europe is much longer than many people predicted, because people very often, especially politicians and researchers, they do consider that to finalize, I would say, the project is to put it on the paper. And it is, in fact, the beginning of the process. It's not the end, but the beginning, the first.
I just wanted to add that we have ourselves to blame. The European Council on Foreign Relations, in the scorecard that we conducted, we asked every government in the European Union if they had a special relationship with the United States. And believe it or not, all the governments had this special relationship that they cared for. So by going in this special relationship solo, by going in this bilateral relationship, we undermine this approach as European Union.
Okay, a question, just true or false? A true or false question. Europe, apart from Britain and France, who sometimes exhibit strategic reflexes, Europe and no other country in Europe can think or act strategically. Correct or false?
I'm not sure what you're meaning by strategically. I mean, Turkey, it's a European country, it's not the European Union. Turkey and Greece have their own strategic interests in that they're part of Europe. Poland has its own strategic concept as to its relationship with Russia and with the countries to the east.
Now, to act strategically by that, I mean being ready to use force in the service of the national interest, and to have a conception, strategic conception, which extends beyond its narrow borders.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to what you're really saying is military capability. And the United Kingdom and France both have public opinion which is willing to support quite substantial defense expenditure. And I think one of the problems for Europe as a whole is that if Europe does see itself as a potential region, a potential political entity that should carry as much weight in the world as the United States or Russia or perhaps China, then all the countries of Europe have to come to a judgment as to whether they are willing to include military capability along with diplomatic and economic power. Frederick the Great once said that diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. You may not use them, but if you don't have them available as one part of your response to political threats, then you are unlikely to have the same influence. And Europe as a whole does not have that capability at the moment. France does, the United Kingdom has, the United States is in a world of its own.
Hobbes said covenants without arms are just words. So you were being very cautious there has to be a kind of new understanding as to whether Europe should want to use force or not. I mean, the obvious thing is that Europe doesn't like to use force, and that our societies have become very civilian. In fact, Europe has been priding itself as a civilian power, using different sources of power than hardware and
Just
armies.
one additional point, if I may. Sure, nobody likes to use military force, but if you are facing threats, you cannot belong to a military alliance and allow the financial burden of that alliance to be overwhelmingly concentrated in one country or in a small number of countries. And therefore, this is not a question of European countries each spending as much on defence as the United States. It's a question of whether they are prepared, as a percentage of their GDP, of their gross domestic product, to increase their defence expenditure so at least their contribution reflects their economic and numerical strength.
Anna,
Well,
your body language says you want to say something.
I must say that I would like to be able to disagree with Malcolm, but I agree. In many places in Europe, the vision of our societies, of the army, the military, is a Red Cross kind of thing. And honestly, I must say, and I say this with real shame, it's not just the budget, it's the rules of engagement. And I have to speak about my own country and the rules of engagement that we have had in Afghanistan, or that are not consistent. The problem is that even in France and even in Great Britain, the percentage of people that are going, pacifists, that understand that the army is just to build bridges and schools in places, is rising. And when you see the demonstrations along the road from where the fallen in Afghanistan are taken, you see these demonstrations, and I, as European, I am concerned because, as I say, both societies, French and Great Britain, that were the ones that were an exception, are going European in the sense that you are using.
Adam, what I would like to talk about is not so much defense budgets are the expression of what I'm trying to get off. Behind it, or the fundamental cause, is the willingness to be able to act strategically. Now, from your perspective, you spent how many years in Stockholm researching peace?
13 years.
13 years. But if you go back longer in history, there's a Polish memory that warns about making strategic commitments without having the will and the means to enforce the commitment, which was the British and French promise to Poland to protect it against Germany. Has anything changed? Has international politics changed so we don't need to be able to act like that?
It seems to me that you put your finger on the most vulnerable point in Polish vision of the strategy. Namely, Poland traditionally, not to speak about details, was challenged by two great nations, by Germany and Russia. At the moment, I would say the situation changed dramatically, because being together with Germany within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and European Union, and what is not without importance, that since the beginning of the history of the Polish-German relations, we have now the best relations with Germany we have had in the history. The situation with Russia is an open question. It is not, I would say, something I would like not to say that Poland is threatened, but the process of mutual understanding, the process to be within the same security community, is still an open question. And it is the open question not for the reason that the countries, not only Poland, but all the other countries in Europe are threatened, because in my view, one of the problems, what you raise, is that in the past, the strategy of the European nations was not defined by politicians or researchers or intellectuals, they were defined in practice because of the need, since nations were challenged by the existential threat for them. Now we do not have this existential threat because, in my view, the main problems, the main challenges are not between the states, they are within the states. And the main challenge for Europe is not from Russia, but within Russia. What kind of development will be in Russia? What kind of development will be within the European Union? And this is, I would say, the great intellectual, but first of all political challenge to understand properly what kind of strategy we need for this qualitatively new situation which never existed in Europe before.
I agree with you perfectly. The strategic threat to Europe has practically disappeared. The strategic threat to Poland has also almost disappeared. At least Poland is now best friends with one of the culprits, namely Germany, but not with Russia. And you're saying, no, the real threats are inside societies. Well, yes, but not quite. I mean, the case of Libya, which demanded strategic action on the part of Europe, is one example, and Syria, which may require some action maybe tomorrow, depending how fast things move, require another strategic choice. And by strategic choice of vision, I mean something beyond one's borders, defending against an attack, but using power in order to create certain stabilities or order. So here we have the domestic threats that you are talking about and some residual peripheral threats like Libya or Syria, or it could happen in the Balkan again or anywhere in the Middle East.
Yeah,
I would like to say that. And if this, tell me what kind of strategic concept do you need for those two things?
I would like to say, since Madeleine is with us, I would like to recollect, I would say, our conversation more or less 3 years ago when we discussed, I would say, the new strategic concept for NATO. And at that time, the previous Secretary General of NATO, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, said that Afghanistan is the test for NATO. And in our discussion, I said that I would suggest to replace the word of test, because Afghanistan is not the test for NATO. Afghanistan is task for NATO, but it is not a test. NATO was not established with an intention to resolve the problem of Afghanistan, of Syria, Libya, or some other. In other words, we are, I would say, under the situation that after the end of the Cold War, with the totally new security environment, we are obliged.
Is that what you are saying?
What we have had, and that's.
Is that what you want? European.
Yes, we have had. I would say that, and this is reflected in the new strategic concept of NATO 2020. But the problem is with such strategic concepts, they are very thoroughly discussed before they are accepted. When once are accepted on the highest level at the summit, nobody is reading them. And this is the problem, that we finished our work a year ago, and people have forgotten that it is already that the whole discussion and a lot of the new ideas which are reflected in this. And I would like to say that, for example, in order, I would say, not to be very theoretical, I would like to say that what in this new strategic concept is really qualitatively new. Namely, the core of the NATO is Article 5, self-defense of the members of the alliance. But in this strategic concept of NATO for 2020, there are three core tasks. One is Article 5, self-defense. Second, crisis management. And the third, collective security. In other words, security and defense based on the cooperation, cooperative security. And in fact, people have forgotten that this cooperative security, it means something. What does it mean? That we have not only the members of NATO, we have a lot of partners, more partners than members. But these partners, some of them, they are closer to NATO, some are not very close to NATO. Some, in fact, are cooperating with NATO.
Adam, let's stay closer to home now. Yeah. We have identified at least 2 examples of threats that are not strategic, outside our periphery, which has been Libya and which may be Syria. Malcolm, you come from a country that still has a kind of sense of strategic vision. What's your prescription for our new strategic concept? Should we have a capability to intervene? Do we have it? I don't think we have it.
Well, I think you've got to think of 3 separate potential roles for NATO. As Adam said, you have the original Article 5. If any member of NATO is attacked, we have collective security. And the closest we came to that was the attack on New York, the Twin Towers, which is why we ended up in Afghanistan indirectly. The second area is where the West as a whole thinks it has a strategic interest and intervenes. And that happened, obviously, in the use of NATO in Libya, for example. And it could happen in other areas potentially. But there is a third category which is very important. If there is, from time to time, a need under the United Nations Security Council, if there is a need for a response to a crisis, and that response should have a military component, if you don't get it from NATO, who do you get it from? Because the idea of creating coalitions of the willing don't work, because they have no experience normally of working together. They have no military training. It takes the crisis has long since been over before they actually get to the spot. So what we happen to have for historical reasons in NATO are a large number of democratic countries with 60 years of common training, working together, accepting supranational leadership in the field, which hopefully can be used if the Security Council wants them to be used, where there is a military component as well as a diplomatic or economic component.
Let me push you a little bit. Let me push you a little bit. Here's a scenario. Obama is going to win the elections, and he will continue to cut the defense budgets. Whether to the bone, I don't know, but he will cut it. There will be contingencies, like Syria, and the Obama administration has already signaled to Europe over Libya, look, this is the heavy lifting has to be yours. We're not going to run this show. The United States provided the heavy lifting, the ammunition, the intelligence, etc. So that particular time, the United States did more than it said. And next time it may say because A, of further cost cutting in the United States, B, the shift to Asia. He said, you know, you boys and girls, you guys represent 500 million people. Your collective GDP is about 2 trillion bigger than ours. Now, what the hell are you doing? Well, and then all this bullshit that I hear in NATO communiques and concepts will come down to the hard question, are we going to use military power? Sure. Do we have it? We don't have it, do we?
No, Joseph, you are certainly right that the United States is entitled to say to Europe, you are a major world economy.
The biggest.
Spend more on defense. But hold on. You've got to get this in perspective. Yes, the American defense budget is coming down, but just look at the figures.
700.
I mentioned the United Kingdom is the 4th largest defense budget in the world. We spend about 30 to 40 billion a year, as do the French. The United States doesn't spend 30 to 40, it spends 700 billion a year.
Not including
pensions. The United States is
not including pensions. It's going to be 900.
Yeah, even take away the pensions, it's still 600 billion.
No, 900 with pensions.
Yeah, so, you know, the United States is not just a superpower, it's a super-duper power. It is unique. And so the United States can afford, if it wants to, that's a question of political will, it can afford to have global military capability for the foreseeable future. Even China may be increasing its defense expenditure, but it's still at less than 1/10 of the United States. So it's a political judgment, not a financial judgment, as to whether Europe, rightly in my view, should accept its responsibilities for a greater defense capability.
Listen, your and the German and the French budget, not that long ago, was about 45 billion. Now down to 30. So these facts are pretty incontrovertible. I'm not even going to talk about the Spanish budget, but what would you like?
But I'm not speaking about the Spanish budget because this goes much well beyond. Well, first of all, this issue that we do not pull our weight, this is since the beginning.
No, I don't mean that. That's not what I mean. I mean,
yeah.
Assume it's the wolf is going to be at the door. The United States says, you take care of your neighborhood.
But let's just address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that we have been free riders on the United States, and you cannot change this from one day to the next. This is something that the United States have to understand. And on what Malcolm was saying, I mean, if you add all our budgets and all our European Union budgets on defense, and you add all the BRICS budgets on defense, we are well above. So let's take this with a long-term perspective. You cannot, honestly, you cannot, and you cannot, being the United States, you cannot just pivot. You have to just, slowly, and yes,
like a waltz.
We are in the worst scenario because we are short of cash, we have a lot of problems, and we have something that hasn't been said, is that our societies understand that because we overcame our problems by dialogue and by peaceful means, everybody has to. And the second issue is that the European Union is built on amnesia, on just forgetting what happened before World War II, and just building towards the future. But the truth of the matter is that in the world, nobody is amnesiac. And we are facing all these issues, which are what is loading our societies. And I hope that, honestly, I hope that we will wake up, that our societies will wake up. We will have to have a shock. And by the way, we Europeans, we tend to be lately, 20th century, we tend to be late in waking up to the real dangers that we are facing. So I'm confident. I think that we have to face this, but the United States have to understand that they have allowed this situation to build up for a long time, and that they cannot say, honestly, they couldn't say from one day to the other, just go ahead.
May I disagree? I think it was perfectly okay to be a free rider during the Cold War because there was an American interest in defending Western Europe against the Soviet Union. So, yes, it was a free riding issue, but the Europeans also paid a lot of dues. They paid about 3% of GDP in defense, but it wasn't the American interest to let the Europeans free ride. Now, if there is that pivot we are talking about, or the slide to Asia, and the United States, as a result, says, you guys, you really have to take care of your own neighborhood.
Come on, you have said the word. It's not in the interest of the United States to let us down. And the evidence is that in Libya, you did not. I mean, in Libya, you said you were prepared to go that far, and in the end, you went much further because it was an interest of the United States.
So Anna says, the old logic, the old strategic logic, where the United States, as the biggest player in the production of public goods, will continue to pay the largest share. That logic still holds, even though the strategic threat for which it was built has disappeared. Do you guys agree with this?
No, it's not that there remain strategic threats, but they're different threats.
Yeah.
It's not a threat from the Soviet Union and Europe. There are global issues which Europe has as much of a self-interest in addressing as the United States. But because Europe is 27 different countries, only some of these countries have global foreign policy. Most of them do not have a global foreign policy, don't particularly want to have one, and therefore could never get democratic consent in their own territory for an increase in their defense capability to contribute towards it.
Does yours have a global...
I'm sorry?
Does your country have a global...
The United Kingdom still has a global foreign policy. We're not a global power, but we certainly have a global foreign policy, and we have a trade interest and a diplomatic interest in most parts of the world.
But honestly, I think, Malcolm, that you are overlooking the fact that the support for defense expenditure is dwindling in the United Kingdom as it is dwindling in France. And as I said, I wish I could say that in Spain we would have the same figures, because our figures are even lower. But the truth of the matter is that it's not a matter of, of course it is, the universal intellectual, I would say, ambition of Great Britain and France, and this is an asset for all Europe. But and this is true, but we cannot just overcome the fact that our populations have to be waken up. And my take is that we will. And I think that I have the 20th century of Europe as the evidence that we tend to be asleep until we wake up.
Adam, what do you want to contribute to this sleeping?
I would like to make 3 points. First, it seems to me that we cannot ignore the fact that security is not at the moment limited to the military dimension. Even more, military dimension is less and less relevant to secure European Union and Europe as a whole. The main problems, as I said, are not between the states, where the traditional classical armaments were relevant. At the moment, problems are within the states. What does it mean? That all the conflicts, without any exception, in recent 20 years, we have had in the world more than 70 military major conflicts. Only 3 of them were between the states, between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, between Eritrea and Ethiopia as by effect of the secession of Eritrea, and the last, it was American intervention in Iraq. All the other conflicts are within the states. Within the states are usually civil wars. And when you have a civil war, the reaction of the external powers should be totally different than in the case of the war between the states. And to raise, I would say, that question as you are raising, that it is a strategic challenge for Europe to intervene in Libya, to intervene in Syria, to intervene in some... It is not, I would say, we have a lesson of Afghanistan, we have a lesson of Iraq, and in my view it is enough to think in very serious way what has to be done in order to react in different way. In other words, the high expenditures for military expenditures in Europe will not resolve the problem in Syria. It was a time to prevent the war, but for different reasons we were not able to do so. In my view, Europe to a great extent is much more, I would say, prepared to play the role in neighborhood, in non-military, with non-military means than the United States with military means. And this is my main, very basic
I agree,
message.
I agree. There haven't been any interesting interstate wars in the last 20 years, though there have been lots of interesting interstate wars in the last 50 years. But I agree with the basic diagnosis that the real bad, interesting stuff is within countries. But these conflicts have a way of spilling over.
Absolutely.
Like the Syrian conflict, which has involved not the overt activity of several great powers in the neighborhood, but the interest and attention and sub rosa activity, with everybody delivering arms of support one to another. So here's the question. Yes, I agree with you. Europe is a very good civilian power. Most of the issues have to do with non-military intervention, but we don't even have, if it push came to shove, Europe, can't even get to Syria. We do not have the kind of transport projection forces, tankers, troop transport planes, landing ships that one would need to, if one decided that we had now reached the internationalization of the conflict. And the question is, on the basis of your diagnosis, would you say, forget it, we don't need that, let somebody else do that?
I do agree. I would like to say that, in my view, the transportation, by the way, is a problem of the new type of armaments. And this new type of armaments, which is not offensive, but I would say, for example, we have now at the beginning of the end of our presence in Afghanistan. And it is possible to do it in a very efficient way under the condition that Russia will cooperate with us, mainly in the process of transportation of our troops from Afghanistan. Another problem is, you mentioned Syria and Mediterranean, but I would like to say that it is another...
Our bombing planes could not have organize a bombing campaign against Syria. We could not without American
Then I will give you another example. Since you are speaking only about Mediterranean, I would like to say that we have had a small war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. Mm-hmm. And definitely it was not possible for the United States to play an active role, but for European Union it was. However, since I mentioned this, I would like to say that OSCE was in a position to do a much better job than the European Union because it was already there and it was possible to make the use of all these missions which were well established. My intention is we should not be concentrated only on the Mediterranean. We should take under consideration also the eastern neighborhood, including Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Caucasus. In other words, this is the region where, in fact, our policy should be oriented with an intention to prevent something what at the moment is unthinkable. But in case that it will be ignored, it will be with us.
Wait, let me just rephrase the question to the two of you. Here you heard a very intelligent kind of plaidoyer for Europe not to be a military power, but to be a Europe power with its peculiar means, sub-military, which it richly possesses. So let's not get into a comparative disadvantage game. Let's use our comparative advantages. Your responses.
Well, yes, I reject the suggestion that we have to make that choice. First of all, so far
as... Good diplomat.
Yeah, well, no, I say it for a very simple reason. Yes, Adam is absolutely right that Ukraine, what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Moldova, what happens in Belarus and Russia, of course, are of huge importance to the whole of Europe, not just to Poland or to Central Europe. But that does not in itself require a short-term military capability. It may one day, long-term, we hope not. It certainly doesn't require one in the short term. The Mediterranean is as important to Europe as is Eastern Europe, including Russia. And, you know, in Prague, of all places, one should not talk about faraway countries of which we know little, as was used at the time of the Munich Treaty in 1938.
That sounds good.
No, it's true, because what happens in Syria, what happens in North Africa, is not just of ethical interest, it's not just a humanitarian issue, it is fundamental to the safety of Europe as a whole. Let me just give one tiny example. What NATO did in Libya, helping the Libyan people overthrow Gaddafi. We now have this week the emergence of a moderate, liberal government in Libya. Think how much improvement there has been, not just for the people of Libya, that's the most important thing, but think of the contribution that makes to the security and stability of the Mediterranean, including Europe, the fact that we no longer have a crazy Gaddafi-type dictatorship in that country, but now have a government accountable to its people, moderate in its policy, and an ally, not a potential enemy. Now, that is just one example of how you can, in a sensible way, use not just political pressure, but just occasionally military capability as well to help bring that about under the auspices of the Security Council of the United Nations. All of it was done under UN authority, and therefore it's something we can all be rather proud of.
Okay.
Well, honestly, I'm not that optimistic. I think that it's a great improvement, it's a great issue, but from there to say that we have a moderate government in a country that is absolutely split between the different tribes and the different regions is a bit far-fetched. But I think the example stands, nevertheless. And where I disagree with Malcolm is that he said we don't have to make the choice. I think we cannot. We cannot make the choice. We need the soft power. We need this civilian strength of the European Union, and I think it's great for the world that we have developed all these capabilities. But all this is meaningless if you don't have a military power, not to use it, but you need to have it to be credible. As simple as that. The European Union, take another area, take what we have been spending in the Arab-Israeli conflict. To what avail? We really don't have the levers. And we don't have the levers, you may say, well, this does not have anything to do with this military strength. And I think it does. It is. And in the end, all this comes to this idea that we have to change the public opinion. We need to alert the public opinion. Unfortunately, for a long time, all the elites in Europe have been clapping on Europe just building up this civilian power and just betting on a world that without conflicts where Europe would be, because we have been preaching this and putting ourselves as the example. And what we have achieved in Europe is great, but frankly it's difficult to translate into other regions. And we have to understand that all this is a big strength, but the world is the world as it is, and not as Europeans have been imagining and telling our public opinions it was.
Malcolm, how often do you go out there to the hustings in Kensington, preaching to the nation of Kensington, we've got to do more for our defensive capabilities?
Well, actually, in my particular part of London, that's not a problem because I have more retired generals and admirals and air marshals than in most parts of the United Kingdom. So that is not my problem.
Having given you the laugh, now let's get to the next one. Let's say you would go not to Tunbridge Wells, of course, but you would go to more like Manchester or Bristol. Why aren't these folks doing what Anna bids them to do, which is to instill in the electorate a sense that we need to have capabilities and therefore pay for it? Because your great nation of Great Britain is now down to the same low level of spending as the Germans.
It's very, very interesting your question, because public opinion in the United Kingdom gets upset, gets worried when we cut defense spending, not when we increase it.
Wow, cool.
When we cut the size of the armed forces, that's bad news for the government of the day, unless it can justify it. Whereas in many European countries, it's the other way around.
Very interesting. You'll have to tell me how this is being done. Adam, did you want to say something?
No, in fact, I do agree with Anna in a sense that in order, I would say, to be credible, there is a need to have some reliable military forces, because we cannot ignore that the world is not like Europe or the United States. The world is very much divided. It is not united. However, the organization has the name United Nations, but they are not united, they are disunited. In other words, my intention is to say the following, that we have diversified world. And what is the main problem, and in my view, the main weakness of the Western policy to the world, is to apply to them the model and the rule of conducts which are relevant to the United States and Europe, to transatlantic community, but these steps and models are not relevant to the rest of the world.
Okay.
That's it.
Let's just move to the next question, because we have about 20 minutes. Let me start with the true or false question. The relationship between the United States and Europe has never been better than it is today, certainly by contrast to the regular crises of the past, like Persian deployment or Suez or the Iraq War. True or false? Is the relationship better than it has ever been?
I think it's true and false. And I'm sorry, I keep having to disagree with the nature of the question. I'll tell you why I say that. Because it's one of the things that I was critical of the British government when it went to war in Iraq. The feeling that Mr. Blair had that he had to be close to the United States, otherwise the relationship would be severely damaged. If you look at the whole history of the last 70 years, For example, in the case of the United Kingdom, there has not been a British Prime Minister that has not had passionate disagreements with an American president. Correct. Churchill and Roosevelt strongly disagreed. Anthony Eden and Eisenhower over the Suez crisis, another example.
Skybolt, Macmillan.
Harold Wilson refused to send troops to Vietnam. Margaret Thatcher had a furious row with Ronald Reagan when the Americans tried to prevent the United Kingdom and other European countries trading with the Soviet Union.
Okay, name me a major crisis now.
Now?
Yeah.
Now, I think there's not a major crisis as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, but I think, generally speaking, there is a growing perception in the United States, in Congress, not so much in the administration, particularly in Congress and therefore in the American public, that Europe is not taking its fair share of the burden. And therefore, inevitably, there is a question mark about what is this NATO alliance all about.
No, I think it's worse than that. That's the core complaint of the last 60 years. To now it's Europe, boring.
Yeah, well, it's good to be boring. It means there's no crisis in Europe. I mean, it's frankly because there's no war likely to break out that Europe is not in the headlines.
So the relationship is basically good, right? Better than it has been at most times.
The danger is complacency, not hostility.
Okay. Anybody disagree that this is the best time we've ever had in Atlantic relations?
No, it is definitely not the best time. I would say the best time for the relationship was with the common threat. And at the moment, there is no such a common threat. The threat is defined by the United States in different way than the Europeans are defining for themselves. And this is, I would say, the problem. Not the problem whether we have a kind of the enemies. We do not have the relations are how to defend democracies. In other words, the transatlantic community is the community of the democratic states.
Isn't the worst thing that could happen to Europe American indifference?
Yes.
Well, what I think is that probably we are at the most challenging moment, because unless we give content to this transatlantic relationship, the core of what has been the transatlantic relationship since World War II has gone. So this is a big challenge for both sides of the Atlantic. And the worst thing, I think, it's what indifference. Absolutely, this would be a big problem. And honestly, I don't know about you, but my feeling is that in the American public opinion, Europe is out of the radar screen as subject, and it is in the radar screen of objects, so of problems, but not of problems of big security threats, but of a problem that the public opinion in the United States does not identify. But what is clear is that we have gone, and this is dangerous, from this idea of alliance against communism, against Soviet Union, to a very diffuse objectification of Europe as a problem not very clearly defined, and meaning in public opinion, not in the elites. In the elites, these are informed opinions, and this is different.
So we keep talking about that the most powerful glue of the alliance has been the Soviet threat. The Soviet threat is gone. There's no strategic threat on the horizon. And there's, and Anna just added, and there is a solvent, actually, a new and unfamiliar solvent of the relationship, which is this indifference or the sense that Europe doesn't matter or is just irksome. But when we started this conversation, we heard something else. There must be more to this alliance than a strategic threat. Otherwise, it would not have persisted for 12 years after that threat disappeared.
I think where you're missing a dimension is you're talking about a relationship between the United States and Europe, as if it is a single Europe the relationship is with. The reality is that the United States has a lot of bilateral relationships with individual countries, with the United Kingdom, with Germany, with France, with Spain, each of which have substance, each of which can be important in different ways. In the case of the United Kingdom, for example, if you're looking for hard facts of that relationship, there are two. One is the military relationship, the second is intelligence cooperation, which is deep and intense, goes back 60 years, and is so intimate in terms of its volume and its quality. It makes a real added value in both directions. In the case of France or Germany, it's obviously different, but it has substance in its own way. So if one simply thinks of Europe as a single entity, then it looks pretty uninspiring, unimpressive.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there's a vacuum there.
But what else is there? I mean, like one thing that recurs with regularity as the diagnosis that, you know, things have never been worse, is the idea of creating a kind of economic alliance now. It's called a free trade area or what have you. Should we pursue this kind of a bit more insistently? I tell you one reason. If you look at the statistics, not only is Europe the biggest economic power in the world, but the Atlantic trade and investment relationship is also the biggest in the world, far bigger than with China or anybody else. So should we think about a NAFTA too, North Atlantic free trade? Well, or should we say, hey, let's do without integration. Look at the problems with the euro and monetary union.
Well, I think that in these economic terms, Europe has an entity. Mm-hmm. And as I personally am a dyed-in-the-wool Europeanist, and this is, of course, there are different sensitivities in the European Union, and we have to be aware of that, because it's true that I mentioned these bilateral relations that all of us have, and all of us understand, all the 27 understand that these are privilege, and I mean privilege relationship. Which means that for the Americans at a certain moment, yes, it is boring. Yes, it is boring to have. I remember I contribute negotiating on behalf of the European Union, because a bilateral treaty after SWIFT on personal data exchange. And of course, what the Americans tell you, and they are not without reason, is okay, but you are telling me and you are speaking of us, the European Union, but I can tell you that Minister X from country Y was here yesterday, he was telling me something else. So we have to come to terms with this reality. And we have to come to terms if we want to go forward with this idea of Europe, or the title of our panel was hanging together, hanging separately, and there we are. So as in my opinion, our future is hanging together. Yes, I think that there is an area, because Malcolm may say in defense, and he's right, but if you take the European, and you take Banco de Santander, and is it Spanish? It's European, it's transatlantic. So our big companies, our economies are so integrated that we should take advantage of that. And I'm saying we Europeans, to boast Europe. And honestly, it is, in my opinion, in the interest of the United States to boast this emergence of a European personality.
But you know, I think what you're saying also is we don't have to worry about creating new institutions. That relationship is so strong, so old, and goes so deeply into the fabric of our national lives that it will persist by itself. No. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, I have been part of a transatlantic panel under the auspices of the German Marshall Fund that studied that. There is a lot that can be done in this area. Of course, there is a lot there, but there is a lot that can be done. And we have to bet, I mean, in my opinion, I will fight for that, because I believe in it, and I believe in it because it will help make this European Union, as I say, personality emerge. I mean, let's be clear, in this audience there are many of us that know the skirmishes that happened when, in accordance with the last treaty that we all have signed, the European institutions wanted to have the corresponding presence in United Nations, and we know what happened. So there are different sensitivities. We have to take into account all of them, but for me, it's clear where we have to be.
We have 10 more minutes, and I want to say something nice about our audience. They have been very attentive, listened to us very carefully, to our highly intelligent conversation. I wonder whether somebody has some short and pithy questions he or she would like to address to the panel. Do we have a microphone in the room? No, then you have to get up and scream. Hey, great.
So I'm not going to repeat myself and torture you, but as to your question, the title of the panel says, hanging together or hanging separately. From your very insightful, at times provocative thoughts and ideas, I say that our future pretty much hangs in the balance. So, so hopefully,
What is it? Get the question,
but
please.
the question is, you've mentioned Russia. I wonder what is Russia's role in U.S.-EU relations? Is Russia a spoiler? Is Russia going to divide us, or, in face of many challenges we face, Russia-related? Is this an opportunity for us? Thank you.
Who would like to give a shorter answer than the question? Brits are usually very pithy.
Okay. No, I think Russia in the short to medium term is a country with which we have differences of view, but also much that we share in common. There are many aspects of foreign policy where we have a common interest.
Okay.
But the problem at the end of the day with Russia is we do not yet know for certain whether Russia is going to become a democratic society that respects the rule of law, or whether it's going to opt for long-term authoritarian government.
Okay,
and because Russia is a nuclear superpower, and that means that in the long term, we cannot simply relax and say Russia will always be a friend. That we hope will be so, but cannot be said with certainty.
Adam?
Well, I'm sorry.
Please.
You say
Adam,
and
come
I understand Adam. Well, what I would say is that the transatlantic relationship has to have an entity in its own, and it's not. We should not depend on spoilers or opportunities. We should go to face spoilers, or we should go to address opportunities, because it is in our common interest. Our common interest has to be in itself and not depend on the externalities.
Quick.
Well, I would like to say that it seems to me that Russia is a good example that relations are diversified on different layer zone. And as rightly Malcolm said, as far as the strategic factors which are identified with the weapons of mass destruction, with the problem of non-proliferation, missile defense, etc., there are a lot of the very cooperative bilateral negotiations between Russia and the United States on different levels without Europe. And in my view, they are really cooperative and rather successful. As far as the other levels, it is much more difficult to say what kind of relations, how to define them. And I have to say that in our discussion here, we discuss mainly the problem of might and interest. But we ignored, for some reasons, I would say, values. And in my view, this element of values, which is common for the transatlantic community, they are very much undermined in Russia as universal. They are saying that we have our own values, and they are not the same as in the United States or in Europe. I'm not going out to discuss what kind of values, but what, for example, recently, yesterday, I have seen in the Russian television, it was, I would say, the parliament accepted, the upper chamber of the Russian parliament accepted, I would say, some rules which are undermining the concept of the democratic community. In other words, when Malcolm mentioned the respect for law, the state of law, rule of law, it is one element. But rule of law, the nations of the nations under the governance of the rule of law are not always democratic. Very often autocracies are with the rule of law, but non-democratic. But you cannot imagine the democratic nations without the rule of law. In other words, for Russia, in my view, at the moment, the main problem is to establish respect for the rule of law, both for the society and for the rulers. And then we can discuss, I would say, whether they are going, I would say, to establish the democratic society.
We have 5 more minutes to the most important event in this conference, which is the coffee break. Very quick, if I may.
My name is Pierre Lévy. I'm the French ambassador in the Czech Republic. Thank you for this very interesting panel. It seems to me that when we talk about the US, when we talk about security issues, we see very well that there are two dimensions, hardware and software. Hardware, you mentioned the figures, the difference, but it seems to me we should, and I would like very much to have your reaction on that, when we talk about pooling and sharing resources, which is one way to do things inside the EU, how much can we go forward in this, in the current context? Secondly, about the software, which to me is very important. You mentioned at the beginning, do we think in terms of, do we have a strategic thinking? I think there is one point which is missing, which is the question whether we share the same security culture. That's one point very important for us. I say that in front of Mr. Rifkin because we share many commonalities in what you said. I fully share your approach. But I think to build something, you need to dream together, but you need also to have the same fears. And when you see the debate inside the EU, when you see the debate inside NATO, we see how much sometimes it is difficult among Europeans. Last remark concerning the software. It seems to me there is a huge difference also between the US and the Europeans, which is the perception of Asia. We Europeans tend to see Asia in a much more positive way as a land of opportunity. We tend sometimes to see the rise of China is a more positive way than in the US for many good or bad reasons. But I think it's very important to reintegrate in our strategic thinking this question of Asia, where Europe has some key interests, and we spend a lot of time in the last white paper defense exercise we did in France in discussing that and taking the proper steps to integrate this issue in our strategic thinkings and our tools. Thank you.
Voilà.
Merci.
That was not a question, but it was a very interesting statement.
The particular point I wanted to comment on is whether there can be a European dimension to foreign policy. And I think we have to think of this not as an event, but as a process. I mean, after all, it's only in the last 100 years we had 2 world wars beginning in Europe. It would be extraordinary if, with that background, all the European countries instantly had a common view of foreign policy. In some areas we already have it. We have it with regard to Iran. We have it with regard to much of the Middle East. We have it largely in relation to China. But there are many other areas where France or the United Kingdom or Germany or Spain have different views, or Greece or whatever. So that will, I think, these areas will get less and less as the years go by, because reasons of geography and trade and other commonalities will mean that Europe will gradually develop a genuine commonality of view as to what foreign policy should consist of. We're not there yet. For Europe to pretend it's there actually devalues the whole concept. And therefore we should recognize and be comfortable with the fact that this is a very gradual process, which will take at least another generation.
Thank you.
God.
From what you have said, Ambassador, I would highlight something that is fundamental and we had not touched upon, which is this idea: can we Europeans share, just put in common, be complementary in having a more efficient use? And this is a challenge. And I would say this is the test of our willingness to really be Europe, or to keep our own army bigger or smaller, but not give up having submarines, or one submarine, or whatever, because this is the real test of what we are speaking about. And unfortunately, right now, this is not very encouraging, what is going on in Europe. And you are right in highlighting this, because this is fundamental. And we blame our societies. It's true, we blame. We just highlight how our societies are against the armies, are pacifist. But we could be much more efficient in using our budgets in a way that by reaching these complementarities, we should not have to ask the Americans for ammunition in Libya, because we didn't have ammunition for more than a week. You know, these kind of things.
This kind of things. You have the last word. Use it wisely.
Yes,
you have the last word.
Yes, I would like to say that, in fact, my intention is to put it in a very brief term, namely, it was a rather naive concept a few years ago, very popular, whether it is possible to establish United States of Europe. And I would like to say my very simple answer is no. There will be no United States of Europe. Europe will be united, but in totally different way. For the reason that European nations, they are very deep-rooted in Europe in totally different way than American society was established as the result of the historical process. This is point number one. And point number two is the following, that this process is, in fact, developed in much more positive way that many of us were able to imagine some years ago. We achieved, I will give you a very simple example about Poland, that Poland has at the moment 7 neighbors. We were neighboring before the end of the Cold War by 3 neighbors. It was the Soviet Union, German Democratic Republic, and Czechoslovakia. All of them, for different reasons, evaporated. Instead of Soviet Union, we have Russian Federation, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. Instead of Czechoslovakia, we have the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Instead of German Democratic Republic, we have Federal Republic of Germany. Before the war, with all of them, we have had very hostile relations. Now, with all of them, we have very good, as I said already, better than in all the periods of Polish history, for example, as far as Germany is concerned, not saying about the Czech Republic and Slovakia. As far as our eastern neighbors, they are divergent, diversified in many respects, but all in all, they are normal. In other words, situation of all countries, including Poland, is much, much better than in centuries. But the problem is that we should not consider that establishing a new institution will be able to resolve the problems. Institutions, by definition, should follow the problems and not other way around. And this is, I would say, my intention to say that European Union is already a great success, and one should not try to find a solution in multiplying some new institutions. One should use the institutions which already exist in Europe, and they are, I would say, for some reasons not in demand. However, they were meant many years ago as a kind of the instrument to improve the situation. I have in mind, for example, within the OSCE area, it is Conflict Prevention Center, but this is the name. In fact, the Conflict Prevention Center does not prevent the conflicts. And the same I can say about, it is not addressing to you. I would like to say that my intention is to say that one should be much more pragmatic and not to be very...
Stop. That was a
yes.
good
okay.
Stop.
Fine.
Thank you very much. I have to be very pragmatic too, because I just got a wave from your director telling me to stop. So I'm being very pragmatic, and I will. And I will tell you that you now have 28 minutes to go. Which way? You have to go this way for coffee and be back here at 3. Thank you for listening so closely and patiently.
Dobré odpoledne. I'm sorry, but I love this language. Before I introduce our next speaker, let me just make a note of explanation. She will leave immediately after she finishes speaking to be received by the Senate of the Czech Parliament. So if you see her leaving, it's not a response to your response of the speech. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce a great lady and a friend. And when I say a friend, I do not mean just a friend of mine, but a friend of a large number of people in this room, in this town, in this country, and around the world. She's a friend of us all. I will not list here all her manifold achievements, past and present, because we only have 2 hours left, and that might not be enough. Suffice to say that she will go down in history as the first woman U.S. Secretary of State, although her granddaughters allegedly wonder what is so special about it, there being no other but women Secretaries of State. She is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Aspen Institute and an accomplished author whose latest book, Prague Winter, will be released in its Czech translation this coming fall. She is known variously as the Secretary, Madam Secretary, Secretary Albright, and also as an, quote, unparalleled serpent, unquote, and other less flattering names in the capitals of countries whose dictators she confronted and stared down. But only in this country, I believe, she is known simply as Madeleine, Madlenka, and sometimes even naše Madlenka, our Madlenka, Madeleine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, Mr. Ambassador. We have been friends for a long time, and I am delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many distinguished international guests. And Mr. Spitzar, it's great to see you, my good friend Norm Eisen, our American ambassador here. And I am very happy to see everyone associated with the Aspen Institute, and I'm very honored to be here. Let me begin by saying how pleased I am that one of my favorite organizations has found a home in one of my favorite cities among so many of my favorite people. The Aspen Institute belongs in Prague, just as the themes of today's conference belong on its agenda. Our title refers to crisis as opportunity, a hopeful proposition that I will use the next few minutes to explore, and I'd like to begin with a little perspective. 92 years ago, in one of his first speeches to the Czechoslovak Parliament, President Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk emphasized 3 themes. First was the need for people to work together across the boundaries of ethnicity and state. Second was his belief that evil, whether originating from within or from without, must be opposed. And third was the need for patience. In that year of 1920, the new republic had achieved independence, but had not yet found its balance. Public expectations were high, but so was frustration. Citizens hungered for miracles in the form of instant solutions to economic and social difficulties. President Masaryk warned that this hunger was beyond his power to satisfy. Czechs and Slovaks, he said, would have to generate their own miracles by treating each other with respect, living up to democratic principles, and working hard to make their new country a success. In the more than 9 decades since those remarks were made, much has changed, but Masaryk's basic prescription for unity, moral vigilance, and patience is still apt. As any student of history knows, there are moments in time when powerful forces clash and whole civilizations rise or fall. But the challenge our leaders face more often is less dramatic, and that is to help governments deliver on the promise of a better life for their citizens. In the world today, there is little appetite for a return to fascism or imperial rule, but there is much concern about the effectiveness of democracy. As in 1920, people are impatient with their governments, not only in this part of the world, but in all of Europe, America, and beyond. As understandable as this may be, we cannot allow frustration to harden into despair. We have a practical interest in showing that the democratic path remains the right one for security, prosperity, and law. Our task begins with the requirement that democratic nations work together, but this can, in fact, be an elusive goal. Governments that want to cooperate can still find themselves divided by competing interests and hemmed in by domestic politics. What seems smart to one country may seem ill-advised to another, and what seems fair to one may cause outrage in the next. It should be no surprise, then, that headlines today are dominated by tales of conflict. In Europe, the debt crisis has highlighted the extent to which national differences still matter, even within organizations designed to transcend such differences. In Russia, Vladimir Putin has regained the presidency, but appears to be squandering the respect and support of his people and also of the international community. In the Middle East, democratic momentum has been uneven because factions that agree on the need for change are often at odds about the kind of transformation they desire. In the United States, partisan bickering has created a poisonous climate in which many politicians seem more determined to attack opponents than to solve problems. Meanwhile, the combination of new technology and social networking has empowered citizens everywhere to voice their views with a breadth, immediacy, and volume never before possible. And this matters because of the widely held perception that our leaders are betraying the future by failing to create jobs, reduce debt, safeguard the environment, instill moral values, and end conflict. For their part, presidents and prime ministers often find that their responsibilities exceed their power and are being removed from office at a record rate. Along the way, many people have lost faith in the institutions relied on to provide stability, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the EU, and NATO. And surveys show that a popular majority, especially in the West, believes that our countries are headed in the wrong direction. So what are we to make of all this? My own reaction is that although we can't afford to underestimate these problems, neither should we be panicked by them. Struggle is part of the human condition, and our present difficulties pale in comparison to those confronted in the past. Consider, for example, the question of European unity. This subject has special resonance in this capital, where earlier efforts to erase national borders were imposed by powerful neighbors. The current economic vulnerabilities are worrisome, but they will never divide this continent in the manner of Hitler or Stalin. The tasks of running the European Union and of administering the Eurozone raise questions of economic philosophy and fiscal competence, but they do not weaken the rationale for joint institutions or destroy the prospects for effective coordination. With few exceptions, most major political parties in most countries are still committed to helping the new Europe achieve its goals. And that's a strong incentive for faith, for trying even harder to identify the right balance between national prerogatives and collective interests. Similarly, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is being pushed by its operation in Afghanistan, a mission to which this republic has long been a worthy contributor. That effort has entered a new and hopefully final phase as the responsibility for security that has been borne by the alliance gradually shifts to where it belongs, the Afghan people. There are some who suggest that NATO has lost relevance in recent years, in part because, as we talked about earlier, members do not always agree on the threats they face or the tactics they employ. Managing a 28-member alliance can be a daunting job, especially when resources are tight and strategists must cope with traditional emerging dangers simultaneously. Yet those who criticize NATO today have a duty to imagine how Europe might change tomorrow if the alliance ceased to exist. NATO's not perfect, but it remains the world's most capable defender of liberty and law, and it's learning new lessons all the time. Finally, there are pundits, some of whom sat on this stage, who claim that the transatlantic partnership has become obsolete and that when America contemplates the future, it thinks first of the Asia-Pacific. But to accept that conclusion is to misread history and to confuse good news with bad. When the United States looks at Europe today, it sees a continent that has been transformed from a source of chronic strife into the world's leading model of how former enemies can live as neighbors. Where Europe once posed a threat to global security, it is now a vital part of the solution. And whether the issue involves finance, trade, arms control, terrorism, or the future of democratic values, the Euro-Atlantic Partnership will continue to assume a pivotal role. It's true that the world today is not as peaceful, prosperous, and united as we would like it to be, and many of our institutions are in need of freshening, and there remain important questions to which we must find better answers. And yet we also have a very firm foundation on which to build. In the first decade of my life, the world fell apart. War engulfed virtually all of Europe and Asia. The Holocaust confronted us with the worst of what humankind can do, and the age of nuclear anxiety began. Today, the major powers are at peace with one another. Incidents of outright international aggression are rare. Totalitarian ideologies are generally discredited. War criminals live in fear. And the global economy, despite its shortcomings, is still producing broader overall prosperity than most generations have ever known. It's fair to say that we live in an age of uncertainty, but we also have much for which to be grateful. Looking ahead, my advice is that we spend less time quarreling about the past and more time looking for practical ways to solve future problems. It's no coincidence that the launch of the Aspen Institute in Prague is designed with precisely that purpose in mind. By training new leaders, developing new ideas, and forming new connections, it will benefit each and all of us for many, many years to come. Thank you once again for your attention and for making me feel as if I've never left my first home. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. In the back of the room, my name is Nick Burns. I am director of the Aspen Strategy Group. I teach at Harvard University. I'm a former American diplomat, and I had the great pleasure to work with Madeleine Albright when she was Secretary of State. The first thing I want to do is thank Michael Jontowski, Ambassador Jontowski, and thank Aspen Prague and its new leadership for the invitation to be in this beautiful, beautiful hall today, and to wish you well, and to pledge support from all the other Aspen satellites and affiliates for what you're doing here in Prague, and all of us are delighted to be here. The second thing I want to do is tell you about this panel. We're going to be here with you until 5:30. I'll introduce the panel. I'm going to pose some questions to them, and then at 5 o'clock we're going to open the mics and ask you to ask questions or give us your point of view. So save those questions. And we're going to talk about the global, as opposed to a regional setting, the global environment, and talk about the shift of power to the east, to Asia, how Europe, the United States, and other countries fit into that. But let me introduce our panel. To my right is Don McKinnon, former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of New Zealand. If you look at his biography, he held nearly every ministerial portfolio that there is in the New Zealand government. And since leaving office, he's been very active. He was very active and continues to be in the Commonwealth and in business, and is part of the Foreign Ministers group that has been meeting for quite some time over the last several years. In the center is Lord Peter Mandelson, who doesn't really need an introduction to most Czechs or Europeans. He was European Union Trade Commissioner from 2004 to 2008. He held several ministerial portfolios in the Blair and Brown governments. He was a senior figure in the Labour Party in Britain, as well as a member of the British Parliament. And finally, my good friend Andrei Kozyrev, who was the first foreign minister of the Russian Federation. And I should say he was, in the late Soviet period, an ally of President Yeltsin in the Russian Republic government. He was foreign minister of that government, and then foreign minister of the Russian Federation from December 1991 until 1996. He is a professor in Moscow. He's been in business. He's sat on many boards, and it's a pleasure to have all three gentlemen with us. So please join me in welcoming them today. So the first panel that you saw talked a lot about how Europe and the United States are feeling about each other, about the transatlantic relationship. We want to go beyond that and really look globally at some of the forces that are transforming global politics. And I want to start with the question, and maybe we'll go right in order from Don to Peter to Andre, about this notion that there has been a strategic shift of economic and political power to Asia. Robert Kaplan, the American strategist, has termed it this way. He says, think of the Mediterranean as the locus of power for the last 400 years, and think of the Indian Ocean as the locus of power for the next century at least. And if we're seeing in the rise of India, in Japan, in China, the global power, countries that are, at least in the case of India and China, new to global leadership circles, what impact is that going to have on the rest of us? And the first question, Don, starting with you, would be, does this strategic shift or pivot or rebalancing by the U.S., but I think by many other countries, make strategic sense to you?
Well, thank you, Nick. And again, I enjoy being back here in Prague. Certainly, I come from a country that couldn't be further from the Czech Republic, and therefore I hope that seeing things from a distance doesn't overly distort. But in the 20-plus years that I've been involved in this sort of international political arena, the United States' involvement in the Pacific has been growing. It's never sort of hesitated, and sometimes I think it's more in the headlines about what the United States is doing than the actual action. So we've seen a continual growth of an American security presence in the Asia-Pacific and a very solid ongoing commitment to an American political presence. An organization called APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, began 24 years ago and in the last 20 years that's always been attended by an American president. So we haven't seen quite an abrupt change, but we read about the fact that there is an abrupt change, and I guess from an Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian point of view, it was to be expected. That involvement, of course, does bring in the question of, is this a confrontation with China? I don't think China wants a confrontation. I don't believe the United States wants a confrontation. But the important thing is that there's a lot of dialogue going on between them. There is a lot of economic dialogue going on between them, and one hopes it's also matched by military dialogue and security dialogue.
Don, if I could ask you a follow-up question before we go to Peter. So President Obama has articulated what they now call rebalancing, they used to call pivot. And when they presented it first, it had a quite military dimension to it. The introduction of U.S. Marines to Darwin, Northern Australia, the buildup of Guam as a major air hub in the Asia-Pacific region, the fact that the U.S. would, for the first time since the Second World War, deploy a greater percentage of its naval forces in the Pacific than in the Atlantic. All of this had a military cast to it. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was downplayed. Do we risk creating a situation where China feels that containment is actually the policy of the United States and its allies, and therefore do we risk a confrontation that we don't seek?
Yeah. There will be people who will want to see this as containment of China. And no, there's no question, if you're looking at the South China Sea, if there is a tinderbox in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, it could be the South China Sea, although I'm putting to one side the hermit state of North Korea. But so far, the responses have been sort of balanced, and that's the important thing. Yes, increase in fleet presence, but as I think it was Malcolm Rifkin said before, look at the possible trouble spots in the world, whether it's in South Asia from Pakistan round to Southeast Asia or the South China Sea. These are the places that do offer problem scenarios.
Thank you. Peter, let me turn to you and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
I wanted to ask from a British and European perspective, is there a fear in Europe, and we heard some of this in the first panel, that the United States is actually pivoting away from its longest and closest friends in the world? Does that worry you, or do you think that's not quite accurate?
Well, I don't think it's quite accurate. I mean, yes, we do have the feeling sometimes that this administration has a tendency to look through Europe to the rest of the world, and that it sees Europe as neither part of the problem that America faces, nor part of the solution that America has got to find. And so there is a sense that America is rethinking its priorities, and that in the process Europe is becoming less important to the United States. Now, having said that, obviously, when you look at the world, if you take a helicopter view, and we can come back to Europe in a moment, I suspect, during the course of our discussions, but if you take a helicopter view of the world, your concentration, your interest is immediately caught by what is happening within and to two countries in the world, principally. One is the United States of America, and the other is China. And it's true to say that the United States is becoming more strategically, in terms of its security, more preoccupied by Asia, principally, but not only really, China, and that it's redressing its economic interests or its trade interests and reorienting those more towards Asia than has historically been the case. Now, does that mean to say, therefore, that just because the United States is sort of creating a sort of new trade pact, a new trans-Pacific partnership, we're trying to negotiate a whole new sort of almost trading system in the world, that it's likely to have any great meaning even if it were created and successfully negotiated, my answer is no. I don't think it's going to be successfully negotiated in the near future, and if it was, I think it would be a fairly superficial sort of trade agreement. I think that the United States is looking to that agreement more as a way of creating a sort of new or parallel trade system that excludes China than any real economic or trade benefit that might derive from it. And if you ask the question again, well, is the United States really looking to Asia to find an alternative set of political soulmates, an alternative set of military allies, a new source of security for the United States and the world as an alternative to its European allies and to NATO? The answer is obviously no, partly because none are available to take the place of Europe and NATO, and secondly, the United States would be rather foolish to imagine that there were. So I am obviously cognizant of these sort of underlying secular changes. I'm obviously fascinated by the relative shifts that we're seeing in the world, but I'm afraid I refuse to get carried away in drawing premature conclusions about where they're going to lead and what's going to be created instead of both the economic and trade and military institutions that exist in the world at the moment.
Right. Peter, when you served as EU Trade Commissioner, you represented globally the largest economy in the world. And yet there are persistent critics of Europe, particularly in the United States, I am not among them, who say that Europe has lost strategic weight and doesn't have a global orientation, but that's belied by the fact that the largest trade partner of the United States is still Europe, the largest investor in the United States is Europe. Does Europe still matter? Does it have strategic weight? And do you think that the EU and Europe, and your country, can develop a global vision for changing times?
Well, Europe has, to its credit, the most extraordinary sort of postmodern, transnational system of governance that we've seen created in modern history. Almost defies belief, even almost defies belief amongst Europeans. And it is an absolutely, in my view, formidable, relevant, practical, a system of transnational governance that we must be very careful indeed to ensure is not threatened by what is happening in the Eurozone at the moment. So I think we would be wrong not to acknowledge what we have already created. We would equally be wrong to ignore what threatens it. But I think that it is true to say about Europe that whilst we have the strategic vision of Europe's place in the world and its deployment, particularly of its soft power in the world, but it has not yet completely been able to translate that vision and that place in the world into sort of practical institution building, or put it a different way, we have huge capacity in Europe, but we haven't yet coupled or harnessed that capacity to the strategic and sort of coherent sort of formula for how that capacity might be used. I would say that we are on a journey. I think that recently we have momentarily started to roll back in that journey, but I don't think that rolling back is permanent. And if we do what we need to do to get through the Eurozone crisis, we can come out of this stronger than we were before.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted, before I go to Foreign Minister Kozyrev, I wanted to welcome back Secretary Albright and just let her know that we're talking about, we're broadening the discussion to global matters and asking whether the reorientation of our policies to the East makes strategic sense. But this gives me the opportunity just to say what a great privilege for all of us as Americans are to have her as our friend and colleague. She's just published a magnificent book on Prague and the first decade of her life and the ravages of the Second World War and of communism. And she was too modest to say much about it in her remarks, so I'm going to say every one of you should read this book. It's a very important book, and I've read it, and I had the opportunity to interview Secretary Albright at the John F. Kennedy Library, so welcome back, Madeleine. Andre, it occurs to me that based on what Don and Peter have just said, Russia has a very unique perspective here. Like the United States, Russia has vital interests in the Atlantic as well as the Pacific. And obviously Russia's Asia and East policy has been an important feature of President Putin's time as it was in your time. So how do Russians see this view that Asia and the Pacific region will be the locus of global power in the next century?
Yes, Nick, thank you. First of all, I would like to take a few moments opportunity to express my gratitude to being invited and welcome the Institute. I, for one, learned a lot from the previous panel, and actually the presentation of Madeleine was, to my mind, a sound of reason to all of us. You know, sometimes we sound so alarmist, and sometimes debate is so alarmist, like panicking, like something happens. But she reminded us on the simple fact that we are living in a much better world, and hopefully we'll be living in a much better world further on. As to Russian perspective, what could you expect from a former foreign minister? A probably historic anecdote. I will tell you that our history of relationship with China is amazing. When I was 10, I was taught in the school that together with Chinese, Soviet people counts to 1.5 billion, and that the Soviets and Chinese are building the new world together against the West. When I started my service in the Soviet Foreign Ministry in mid-70s, and went first appointment to the UN General Assembly in New York, our main enemy in debates was not the United States or the West, although it was still Cold War. But our first target was China, communist China, of the communist Soviet Union, because they seemed to be revisionist or whatever was revisionist. So they were challenging to the Soviet communist system. When I became foreign minister of Russian Federation, that was beginning of 90s, we had what we thought a democratic, almost anti-communist revolution in the Soviet Union. And President Yeltsin was positioning himself at that time as anti-communist leader of the Russian Federation. And Chinese were tacitly and even openly supportive of Gorbachev, because Gorbachev still claimed to be a communist. And when Jiang Zemin, the chairman of Chinese communist state, came to the Soviet Union in 1991, he refused to meet Yeltsin and my humble self because they thought that we went too far in anti-communist democratic intention. And he focused on Gorbachev like nothing happened in the Soviet Union, in order to give the message that Gorbachev still in power, everything will be all right in the communist giant of the Soviet Union. That's why Yeltsin flatly refused to go to China or to meet Jiang Zemin in Russia after the revolution, after we took over, the Yeltsin government took over. And I had to persuade him, I mean, by all means, that China is a giant neighbor on Russian eastern side, and that we have to maintain and preserve whatever there is of friendly relation with this giant nation, because it's neighbor, whatever, are they communist or are they anti-communist or are we anti-communist, and so on. So I went almost without Yeltsin's agreement against his prohibition. I went with a visit to China. It was one of my first foreign visits. And I told them, Jiang Zemin actually, that we should have non-ideological relationship. Now, coming back to today, the relationship with China is dominated by two major factors. Factor number one, which stays for all times, is that it's our giant neighbor. Factor number two is internal dynamics, like it was in the Soviet Union. It was first friend, then enemy again, then friend again, and so on. So the question is very much what happens in Russia next, whether it goes further on democratic development or it stalls there, and what happens to China. That's an interesting question. How long and how much could an authoritarian power, political power, deliver economic development? That's, to my mind, is one of the major wonders of today's world. There is a market-oriented economy and authoritarian regime. The second, actually, wonder of the world, to my mind, is India. India is the major, the biggest, with all due respect to the United States, the biggest by numbers, at least, of population, democracy for a long time, for generations already, and yet its foreign policy is anti-Western. Like our New Zealand friends, they are also there somewhere far from Europe or far from the United States and even far from Russia. But they are democratic and their policy is quote-unquote pro-Western. Yet Indian foreign policy is basically anti-Western. Everybody is focused now on Russian role, and duly so, in Syria. But take Indian position in the United Nations. It's not one of the group of democracies. It's kind of different, right? So that's another one that, to my mind, and the jury is probably still out on all of those. What happens next?
So, Andrei, before we go to the second question, I wanted to ask you a quick follow-up. Do Russians have the same problem that the United States has in describing their relationship with China? Because you ask Americans, people will say, well, China can be, some Americans believe China's a friend. Some say that China's a partner. Other people say it's a strategic, it's an adversary, or at least a potential adversary. Is there a Russian consensus on what you call this relationship and how you measure it?
I'm afraid in Russia today, even less consensus than anywhere in the outside world. I mean, like America, like Madeline mentioned, that America is divided, and it's a real kind of divide. You know it better than myself, and it's almost leads to, paralysis in Washington at certain issues. But that's all a kindergarten in comparison to Russian divide. The Russian divide is still much deeper. It's a question of whether it should be democratic system or not, whether it should be statist government or it should be more like open government, whether it should be foreign policy. So the same is debate towards China. China is a lie as long as China probably stands against whatever, against the West in some points. In other points, it's perceived as a great menace because Chinese are outnumbering Russians at least 10 times, And Russian Siberia, which is very rich in resource, but it is almost unpopulated partly. So there are population ready to come probably to Siberia to substitute Russian. So, I mean, you can hear and you can read a lot of things, but I hope that the policy which I laid foundation for, that is good neighbor, whatever happens, that this policy will stand, and it stands. And President Putin, I have to commend him for the fact that he did sign the agreement which we were even preparing on the border. So there is first time in centuries, thanks God, no border dispute between Russia and China. The whole border is set up in stone, I mean in treaty. So it's very good news. So I don't think there is any real potential, despite all those speculations, real potential for conflict between Russia and China. But to what extent they might be allies, that's the big question. You know, it's a big question, what brings together BRIC countries. But of course they are importer of mineral resource, and that's what feeds Russian economy. So they are a very important economic partner.
Thank you very much. I want to go to our second big issue area. Maybe we'll use the next 15 minutes to discuss it. At 5 o'clock, we're going to go to your questions. If there's a big defining issue of our time, most people would say it's the rise of these new powers globally, China, India, Brazil, regionally, Indonesia, Turkey, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and our hemisphere. Two questions for Don, Peter, and Andre. And you can take this question wherever you'd like to, because you have a lot of wealth, you have a wealth of experience in this. Number one, are these new countries stepping up to global leadership to help us run the international system? I'm thinking particularly of China and India and Brazil. And number two, are we making room for them in the international system? We still have a Security Council that looks a lot like the summer and autumn of 1945. We still have an American lock on the World Bank presidency and a European lock on the IMF directorship. Don, how do you see that? Those two questions.
It is a very complex one. And let me just back up a little bit and say that I'm sure from our part of the world, if you look around the globe, the dominance of purely good democratic institutions with the highest levels of political governance, corporate governance, independent judiciary, reside in North America and Europe. So as far as I'm concerned, they're joined at the hip in so many ways, so strongly. That's not going to be severed easily. What we're seeing in the rise of the BRICS, as the phrase has been coined, are those very large countries that have grown extraordinarily rapidly during a period of great economic escalation. They've gone at very high speed, they've capitalised on opening of markets, they've done extraordinarily well. What they're facing now is an economic downturn. How are they going to handle that? When things are looking good in your country, problems diminish. When economic downturn occurs, problems expand almost to meet that extra space. Are they able to deal with that? Now, of the four, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, you can say that many are still weak in those democratic structures. Will those democratic structures that are there be able to hold up to what people in those countries will be demanding in any kind of economic downturn? I mean, look, China, 5,000 years hasn't had 10 minutes of democracy, so it's really got a long way to go to be a comprehensive partner of many other countries. In Southeast Asia, the 10, 12 countries of Southeast Asia, they are all maturing democracies at different levels. They've all had their ups and downs. but they haven't got the long history of developing those democratic institutions that others have. So, I think we're in for a bit of a rough time, particularly with those larger ones in the next decade, if what the key money people in the world are saying, it don't look too good for a while yet.
And Don, if there's a virtual governing board of the world,
Pardon me?
If there's a virtual governing board of the world, and the traditional powers are the European Union and the United States, and Russia has certainly been on that, are we making room for these new countries to take leadership positions?
I haven't seen much of it up until now. Every time there's a new World Bank president or a new IMF president, or as Madeline knows, any reform of the United Nations Security Council, there's a kind of a hunkering down of those that are there, and a sort of an inability to see a way through that makes any really valuable change.
Thanks. Peter, how do you see this?
Well, just to take up Don's last point, the so-called BRICS would be really rather hard put, wouldn't they, to decide who amongst them should be accommodated, whether it be in the leadership of the IMF and the World Bank, for which leadership posts they were unable to agree a consensual candidate amongst them. When it comes to the Security Council of the United Nations, do you really think that China and Russia are going to be at the front of the queue welcoming India onto the Security Council? Do you really think that India is going to allow Brazil to come onto the Security Council? So, yes, it is true to say that the post-war order, as we have known it, whether it be the Atlantic Alliance, the Washington Consensus, Bretton Woods, the sort of structure and leadership of the IMF and World Bank, all those institutional forces are experiencing relative decline. But they are not facing replacement. And the reason why they're not being replaced is partly because Western capital, Western priorities and preferences, yes, have relatively declined, but they are still prevalent. Whilst we see emerging economies in different parts of the world, and thank God for them because they're helping to drive global growth, and not before time, given our own sort of shortcomings and ineptitude in the United States and Europe, so thank goodness for them. But you could hardly say that the BRICS are replacing Western scientific and technological leadership. You could hardly say they're replacing the sort of cultural and international brand hegemony of Western companies. They're not doing that, and it will be some time before they do start to threaten those things, nor can you really say, if you were being blunt, that the BRICS are much more than a label to differentiate them from the G8. Yeah. They don't have common political systems or values. Their economic interests are frequently at odds. So I think one can get a little bit carried away sometimes in describing the sort of impact of what are very important relative changes in the world, but are not yet, and will not for some time, sweep all before them.
Thank you. And Peter, we can't let you go. I don't know if anyone's going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask it now. Given your experience in the EU, there are a lot of questions now about Europe as a global power because of troubles in the Eurozone. Is Europe exerting the right leadership? Is it being bold enough intellectually to resolve its own fundamental problems? Are you confident or not in the survival of the Eurozone?
That's a very, very good and interesting question. And I'm really glad you've asked it. Of course I am confident that should the leadership that Europe needs, should it emerge, quickly and strongly enough, I have absolutely no doubt at all that the Eurozone is savable.
Should that occur.
You've got your answer.
Okay. So you can come back and ask him questions on his answer. Very good. Andre, this big question about the global system and whether or not we're seeing, let's just take China and India from a Russian perspective. Are they stepping up to global leadership in the way that one would expect, given their ambitions?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say. It's an interesting question whether they are given a place in the world. But what is their interest in the world? That's not particularly clear to me. And what brings together, for instance, BRICS? I mean, it's also not particularly clear to me. In many sense, they are competitors. Like Russia and Brazil, they are exporters of the mineral resources of the we are competitors in that sense, right? With China, we have, as I tried to describe, very complex relationship there in Siberia. So it's a big question mark to my mind. It seems to me that still what brings them together and what is on their agenda is more like negative. It's negative to perceived, to what they still perceive. That is third world mentality, actually. What they perceive as a hegemony of the United States, which you executed in the State Department and the Security Council. And Madeleine was once a iconic of that hegemony and the dominance. So it seems to me that they are mostly brought together by negativism to that perceived phenomena rather than by common interest, because it's difficult to see the common interest. Like to give them more place. To give them more place where? Russia is in the Security Council. Probably some are now feeling it more than the others, like in Syria, right? But anyway, Russia is member of the nuclear club and even nuclear superpower, while India is nuclear, China is nuclear, though not superpowers, but Brazil is not. I mean, you take any big dimension and you see more, to my mind, more diversity than unity in that group. So how can you give a place to a group which is so kind of chaotic, you know, in a sense? So I think they have place which they deserve.
Peter.
Can I just give an illustration of why all these countries don't quite fit into the sort of neat categories or definitions? In 2008, when I was still Trade Commissioner from the European Union, before I had to come back to my own government when the economic crisis began, I was in the final ministerial sessions negotiating the World Trade Round. And I will recall how in July of 2008, the core nations that were together in the green negotiating room at the WTO in Geneva were the European Union, the United States, sort of Australia a bit, China, India, Brazil, and Japan was there, but not exactly participating. What was interesting about why and when those ministerial talks broke up in failure, and why the World Trade Round has not been resumed since then, is that I was on one side of the table with Brazil. Brazilian and European interests, despite our rivalry in certain areas, notably agriculture, we were fully committed to negotiating, to doing whatever it took to bring that ministerial negotiation to a successful conclusion. On the other side of the table was the United States and India doing everything they could, it seemed to me, to prevent agreement coming together so that we had a successful conclusion. We had China sort of poised delicately between the two, on the one hand wanting a successful outcome of the world trade talks, but not wanting to be too demandeur for it, for fear of what it might have to pay into the system in order to get that agreement. Australia backing up the European Union and Brazil, and Japan sort of sitting there saying that they had a very interesting offer in their back pocket, which, you know, they're just about to deploy, but obviously we never got to the point where we ever saw what was in Japan's back pocket. The point I'm making is that in that context, very serious, major trade, international economic negotiations on which the future of the world trading, rules-based trading system, the whole multilateral process and institutions surrounding the WTO did not neatly or conveniently fall into the West on one side and the developing stroke emerging economies on the other. Now, it's all been sort of changed again a bit since 2008. But the point I'm making here is that if we are looking for some neat, predictable set of labels, interests, and sort of negotiating formations conveniently to emerge within the international system, I hope I've done sufficient to illustrate that I don't think it will be quite as neat or as straightforward as some people sometimes imagine.
Thank you very much. Donna, do you have a final word that you wanted to make?
No, I think that did highlight just the massive differences out there in the world, and I think they're going to be accentuated as economic activity slows down.
Right. And we're going to go to questions right now, but we're seeing today, I think, the failure of another major institution where Madeline used to serve, the UN Security Council. The Council is meeting right now in New York to debate a Chapter 7 resolution drafted by the United Kingdom that would ask for a political transition in Syria and the imposition of sanctions on President Assad should he not agree to that transition. And it looks, Andre, at least unless Russia surprises us, that Russia and China may exercise their customary veto, which does speak to the fact that this central political organization is not functioning because we are once again divided into blocks. And forgive me, but from an American perspective, quite parochial, I admit, it seems that the goal of Russian foreign policy is just to block Europe and the United States. And I'm waiting for a President Putin who might begin to take matters into his own hands and provide us with a solution on Syria. I think a lot of people would follow President Putin if he would do that. I don't know if you want to comment or not on that, but you're welcome to, or we can go to questions.
Well, again, you know, I am a partisan of the view that the foreign policy of every country, and particularly of Russia and actually of every country, is guided by two sets of criteria, or two sets of interest. One, you might describe as international or foreign policy in per se. Like the best illustration again is Russia-China, or be it Soviet Union, China. Avoidance of the war and keeping the border more or less stable is national interest of both countries, whatever happens in either of them. But second set of interest is very much related to domestic policy, to domestic dynamics. And that is true for every country, but particularly again for Russia. When Russia was staunch communist and perceived China as staunch communist, it was a lie. When Russian communism was threatened, domestically threatened by what they saw as negative example of Chinese version of communism, they perceived China as major threat, more threat than the United States, because their domestic power was threatened. Now, what happens in Moscow today? They are paranoid. I mean, many people there are paranoid with the notion of so-called colored revolutions, allegedly, again, in their minds, inspired by the United States and the West as a whole. That is, revolution which almost happened in Ukraine, the revolution which happened in Georgia, and in other places. So, from that point of view, any idea of changing the regime in any country, however awful the regime is perceived as an almost vital threat to domestic regime in Russia. I mean, by large, the policy towards, be it Libya or Syria or whatever, is guided by the sense of kind of preservation of whatever regime there is, but it should be not overthrown or not challenged from abroad. So this is one of the major driving factors, as I see it, behind Russian foreign policy. And as long as Russia is hesitating between going further with democracy, which is stated and declared goal even of President Putin, and kind of being like more authoritarian and less democratic, as long as its situation there, the foreign policy will be of two faces, so to say. You will once face Russia as a participant and once as a spoiler, as long as they don't know in which world they are themselves. So, I mean, it's a transitional situation. It's understandable. It takes time. After all, Moses was there in the desert for 40 years, and we are, after communism, in the desert for only 20 years. So we probably need another 20 years.
Okay. On that very positive note, let's go to questions. Just if you would, we have microphones, and we'll right here for the first question. Just identify yourself, and then we'll. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jan Švejnar. I have actually two hats. I'm here in the Czech Republic with Charles University and the Academy of Sciences, and I'm also professor and director of the new Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia University in New York. Very interesting. Let me just add an observation and a question. Okay? I'll start with the question. Are we not experiencing a crisis of leadership, or at least a serious challenge to leadership, in the following way? In addition to what you said, let's take the recent economic developments. Okay? So we have a very serious financial crisis, which is still rambling through, is not resolved, resulting in the most serious economic recession since the Great Depression. And here we have the great leaders of the world unable to deal with it successfully. Take the US and Europe. Together they account for 1/2 of the world GDP, right? Add the BRICS and Japan, and you have 3/4 of the world GDP. So basically 2 to 7 players should be able to come up with policies over the last 4 or 5 years that would handle the challenge in addition to the challenges that you have. And they have not been able to do so. So the question is there a serious problem with leadership? And if so, when can we expect it to change?
Thank you.
And
with your permission, that's a good question.
Just one more period. Or are we to expect a world which is essentially around the way you describe, plus the private sector playing a major part, from the rating agencies to the markets that manage to seriously destabilize otherwise functioning economies and democracies? Thanks.
Thank you. Peter and Don, you've both worked in this sphere.
Well, take Germany as an example of leadership. Some people would say, oh my God, isn't it terrible? There's no really strong, consistent leadership from Mrs. Merkel. We all know what needs to be done in the Eurozone. We all know when it needs to be done. We all know what the scale is on which it has to be done. If only Mrs. Merkel was more like Chancellor Kohl and had the sort of vision and courage to do it. You look at it in a completely different way. You could say, God, thank God Germany has done so much in the last 18 months to bring Europe so far in addressing the emergency action and running repairs that need to be done in different parts of the Eurozone. Thank goodness Mrs. Merkel has shown the clever tactical leadership in bringing her own party, her own parliament, and her own public opinion behind her in enabling Germany to do so much to date to avoid the whole thing falling apart. So, there are different ways of looking at leadership. If you were to ask my opinion about German leadership, I would be more on the sort of benign sort of side of what is a balance of judgment. Of course I recognise that what Germany is doing at the moment is sort of taking us along the very outer edge of a precipice, which if it mistakes sort of where the sort of cliff face ends and the abyss begins, we could very easily accidentally plunge right down. But if I were being honest about Mrs. Merkel's political position, I would have to look at the views of her party. I would have to look at the intervention of the mass media in Germany. I would have to look at the constitutional hoops that she has to go through, as well as the parliamentary ones, every time she wants to get agreement to yet a further extension of the European Stability Mechanism, getting agreement to it being created in the first place, and then getting the funds in it, and then getting it replenished, and then in due course actually replacing the existing system of collective funding we have. You know, she's not doing badly. So I think we have to draw a distinction, in other words, Nick, between what ideally we would like to see happen on the one hand, and on the other, what is politically possible to do and to achieve. And I think, yes, you might say that she's failing in the first, on the first benchmark, but she's doing pretty darn well on the second.
Thank you, Peter.
I think what you've highlighted there is this the time that someone could arise and really offer a solution that everyone says that's the right one? The criteria for that is someone who clearly is not facing an election in the next 6 months or a year. And whichever way you try it, you've got to have the United States on side. So that's held up for another 6 months anyway. And given the number of political casualties in recent times, any leader's got to be pretty brave to say, I know the promised way, follow me. But I think you're right. Someone has to step up those extra high level, be prepared to lose everything, but offer something that people just haven't got right now.
Thank you. We're going to go to a second question right here. I'm advised, by the way, a footnote before you begin your question, that Russia and China did veto the UK's Chapter 7 resolution on Syria this morning.
Thank you. My name is Tomáš Kolvania. I am Vice President of the Aspen Prague Board of Directors. My question is mostly towards Secretary Kozyrev, but also maybe to you, Nick. And it's about the reset in American-Russian relations that the Obama administration tried to undertake at the very beginning of their mandate. Has it been successful, this reset, this restart? And if you think so, give us a couple of examples in what was it successful. And I'm also interested in, of course, the views of the other panelists. But first, please, Mr. Kozyrev.
Yeah, I think it is successful by large. You know, it's just another way to say the same story, right? To tell the same story. Not that President Bush's relations with Russia were so awful bad. It's more or less the same story, but the intention of the Obama administration to rename it and to have a pragmatic approach, which was there already for some time from the United States. And I think this is the only practical solution to the situation. As I said, as long as Russia is wrestling with its destiny or with its internal choices, nobody could influence actually this outcome. You know, Russia is too big to be influenced by one way or the other from the outside. It was true in my time, and it's still true today. It's for Russia to make a decision, and it's painful. It takes time, as I said. So that's hopeless. You cannot affect Russian domestic policy, and in that sense, change fundamentally the foreign policy, which is by large just function of domestic agenda. But the West could well have a pragmatic relationship with Russia, cooperate where it's possible, and have a frank dialogue or frank exchange where they are on collision course. Actually, that's something which I was asking the then Clinton administration to do with us. I mean, just speak frankly and just address where we have agreements and disagreements. But at that time, there was a lot of romanticism, of course, you know, like New Russia, democracy, and everything, which was true. But we needed a degree of pragmatism. Finally, I think they did come to this situation. And I think, and I have to, again, recognize it as to my mind, as an achievement, that today's people in Kremlin, they have also this pragmatic understanding that there are some fields where there is cooperation, even providing routes for transportation to Afghanistan and other things, because it's in Russian national interest. But they collide everywhere, like in Syria, where they feel or they kind of suspect that that is regime change, you know, which is, of course, inadmissible for them. So, I mean, it's a reset is just continuation, and to my mind, a welcome continuation of introducing pragmatism into Russian Western American relations, like in China also. With China, I tried to put it on pragmatic basis. We are neighbors, and we have to have pragmatic relationship, and it stands. So I hope that this will stand, but without attempt to change each other's destiny, because it's only for them, for both sides, to decide where they go.
I would just say very briefly, Sarah Palin reminded us in the last campaign that the United States and Russia are neighbors, and so that's an important fact. But I would say the reset's been successful. I supported President Obama on this. It's been successful on counterterrorism. Russia's a very important partner of ours. On counter-narcotics, as Andrei said. And the Russians were very helpful to us with the northern supply route for our troops in Afghanistan when the Pakistanis were not helpful. So in those three respects it worked. Where it did not work, in my judgment, is on Iran and Syria. We saw it in Syria again this morning. And I don't believe that President Putin is using the influence he does have on the Iranian leadership on the question of Iran's not negotiating in any way, shape, or form with the West right now on the nuclear issue. And I guess I'd say that there's no strategic trust between Russia and the United States. And if President Obama is to be reelected, and I personally hope he will be, one of the big challenges will be, can he develop a productive working relationship with President Putin? It's a two-way street, obviously. But the two of them, if they could find a way to work together, that would make the international system work more effectively. So it's a very important relationship. I don't know, Peter or Don, if you wanted to comment on this.
Look, from a Russian point of view, I think that too often the United States government's approach comes across as, we fully understand and accept that Russia's entitled to its point of view. We fully accept that Russia's interests have to be taken into account. We're fully prepared to discuss this at great length with you. But at the end of the day, we require and expect you to arrive at the same point of view as the one we hold. Now, I mean, it's another way of saying what you've just said. And I think that Russia, for example, in the Middle East, in Syria, does have a national interest. I think it's sort of unrealistic and silly for people to pretend that it doesn't. Obviously, I wish that it interpreted its national interest in a different way and arrived at a conclusion which is the same as my government's, or the government of my country, not my government. But simply to say that Russia is being obstructive, that it's being irrational, that it is wrong to take a position that is counter to the conclusion that we've reached, I'm afraid I don't think gets you very far. I also think, even though I would very much like Russia to arrive at a different position, and I think in due course it will, incidentally, because it will see the balance of forces continuing to shift in Syria, and it will suddenly wake up to the fact that it's going to see a different Syrian government and regime and system replacing the existing one, with which it will also want to have a relationship in due course. But I think we also have to take into account Libya. I, of course, delight in the fact that Britain, amongst others, was instrumental in bringing down Gaddafi. I applaud that. I like it. I like the fact that, my country was doing that. But I also have to recognize that in the process, we used quite a lot of license in our interpretation and application of the relevant UN Security Council resolution. And I remember traveling in China, in Brazil, and India in the 2 months, for different reasons, in the 2 months following the agreement of the UN Security Council resolution. And it was very clear to me that the ministers I spoke to, without any love for Colonel Gaddafi whatsoever, were going to think long and hard before they signed up to a similar UN Security Council resolution very quickly.
Right.
Because they felt they had been bounced.
Thank you.
I think the sad thing is, one last thing really, is that despite the fact of Russia taking that particular stand, there's been no public debate in Russia, there's been no debate in the Duma in Russia about this issue, there's been no debate in the press about this issue. It is very much a single-handed authoritarian stance.
Right. We have time for one more question. Then I just wanted to offer, Madeline, before we end, if you wanted to say anything, that would be your chance. But we're fortunate to have the Czech ambassador to Moscow with us. Please.
Thank you very much, Nick. Is it working?
Yes.
Yes, fine. First of all, I am not the only, currently I'm the ambassador to Russia, but I had a privilege to serve almost 5 years as the Czech ambassador to the United States. And I can say that despite all this blaming, especially from our part of Europe, that the United States is abandoning us and the interest of the United States is declining in Europe, we are allies. We have Euro-Atlantic Partnership and Alliance. Our alliance is based on values. To this family, I could include also Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, some other countries. And we can speak about alliance because we have our allies. That's why I'm so optimistic I'm not, well, alarmist. I really believe that our alliance has a sense and it has its future. My question is to you, Mr. Minister. Would you be able to identify some countries which current Russia would consider as allies, as a real ally? Thank you.
And Ambassador, thank you. I'm going to take the license of the chair to ask Andre to answer that, and then Peter and Don, anything else you want to say? This is your final moment because we have to close by 5:30, and Michael will speak. Andre.
No, my successor, the one whom Madeleine once had a dance, I think.
Primakov.
Yes, Mr. Primakov. He was more of the old school, and probably from my youth, my childhood and his youth, he's 20 years older than myself. So it was his youth. Probably from there, he took the idea that Russia and China and even India, believe it or not, could be allies, real allies. And he even suggested alliance to those two, and he wanted me to do that, which I was very reluctant and always rejected because I said, first of all, what makes us allies? We should be good neighbors, of course, with China, but allies on what basis? And especially bringing India, which actually acquired nuclear weapons because of China having nuclear weapons once, right? So thanks God they are on a very, very good relations, also neighborhood relations between India and China. But allies, I think it's far away. So, and thanks God also, the offer from Mr. Primakov was flatly rejected by Chinese. They said, thank you very much, we are very honored with this offer, but we will stay where we are, good neighbors and good trade partners and so on and so forth. So that saved Russia from another false adventure or alliance in the world. Because the only basis for such an alliance could be, again, negativism, like alliance against the United States or against the West. So good news is there are no alliances and no allies for Russia against the world or the Western world or United States. Neither because China rejects that or because Russia is too adamant to have such an alliance. So good news is that there is no intention on the Russian side and no possibility to have anything like Warsaw Pact anymore, right? This is good news. Good news is also that some dictatorships, like even Assad's dictatorship in Syria, are too much of dictatorships to be real allies of Russia. Russia might be patronizing them occasionally, as you can see, but it's too much of muchness, you know, for Russia to be a real ally. So on that side, there are no allies because they are too much dictatorships. On the other hand, if you look at democratic countries like, say, Czech Republic, it's probably too much pro-Western, too much democracy to be ally of Russia as of today. So I think there are no allies. There are some communities of interest like BRICS, which is very vague. There are some more tight communities of interest like economic relationship between Kazakhstan and Belarus on economic basis. But that's also a little bit far from military or whatever kind of alliance. It's a common market or common interest and anything. And I welcome this development because that keeps Russia free hands, and when it decides on its path, and I do believe that sooner or later it comes back to where we started, that is democratic and open world, then we will easily find alliance in the former Warsaw Pact, right? Why not? I mean, but that will be democratic Warsaw Pact. And so as for today, while Russia is still thinking which way to go, I think it's good to have free hands also in foreign policy.
Andre, thank you. Peter and Don, final words.
Just on Russia, it's completely unrealistic to imagine that Russia, in its present condition, without an open and competitive economy or political system, and in its current leadership, is going to prove to be a dependable ally. I don't think that is realistic. That doesn't mean to say, however, that Russia is therefore disqualified as an interlocutor. And I think it doesn't mean to say that on a good day, in particular circumstances, Russia might be a partner. But a dependable ally?
And it is.
And it is in many respects. And therefore one shouldn't, one shouldn't take this too far. Interlocutor, partner, yes. Ally, though, I'm afraid falls into a different category, a different compartment. Second point is, last point, what people expect, whether it be the public, the voters, or people who make up markets, people who are investors, or people who are looking for somewhere to put their money in the knowledge that they're actually going to be able to get it back, because that's all that markets are, what they expect from politicians and governments are two things: credibility and confidence. They look to politicians and governments to offer a credible plan of action and subsequent behaviour that builds up rather than destroys the confidence of the public and markets that that plan is going to be followed. I think that in 2009, using the G20 as a vehicle, that sort of nascent, sort of emerging steering committee of the global economy, if you can describe the G20 in that way, offered both credibility and confidence. And my word, what an effect it had. It affected people's behaviour. It made it easier to resolve the difficulties we were in rather than harder. It didn't actually bring a permanent solution, but it made it easier to manage the situation and arrive at a solution. And that is the responsibility of politicians and ministers. And at the moment, as is clear to see, we are neither offering credible plans, nor are we consistently building up others' confidence in our actions and behaviour. And therein lies, in my view, the kernel of the international economic crisis that we are experiencing at the moment.
Thank you very much. Don?
Well, one certainly wants to see a greater move towards democratic institutions. Russia's had largely a centrally controlled authoritarian state for the better part of 90 years. And certainly my experience in encouraging countries to be more democratic, it takes a long time. And you only make small gains, but you must have the people in that country on side and wanting it to happen and work with them and encourage them, but don't expect too much to happen inside of 10 years, even 20 years, when you're changing the whole political DNA of a nation. It takes a long time.
I want to thank Don McKinnon and I want to thank Peter Mandelson and Andrei Kozyrev for their thoughts and for being so forthcoming. Thank you very, very much. Now, Ambassador Jantovsky.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end. I'm sure you will all agree that for beginners we have not done too badly. But it is largely a case of beginner's luck. If we had a very interesting afternoon, it is solely thanks to several brilliant speakers we had who took the trouble of going to Prague and enlightening us with their perspectives. We are also lucky in having two excellent, stimulating, witty, and provocative moderators in Joseph and Nick. Thank you. And of course, we had the pièce de résistance in Madeleine and her welcome dose of her sunny nature in this wretched, rainy summer. As for what we've had, speakers mostly agree that in spite of all our problems, this is not a bad world to live in, that the prosperity we live in is unprecedented, the Cold War is over, there are no major conflicts on the horizon, the US pivot to Asia is a result of trade and economic interests, but does not threaten the community of values between us and Europe. And even most recently, that the reset between the US and Russia was basically successful, except for a few minor elements like Syria. I missed a reference to the missile defense, not just to the original bad Bush Russian unfriendly version, but to the new good Russian-friendly Obama-face adaptive approach, which has not fared much better, I'm afraid. There's not too much of great concern. There is some degree of strategic change going on, but most of it is given by external factors. I think the basic question that we have discussed revolves around whether the current crisis that is often referred to in Europe and in the United States and in the relationship between Europe and the United States is a matter of perception, a matter of external factors like other parts of the world coming to the fore and doing better, and temporary difficulties with our economic models, etc., or whether it is a case of an intrinsic crisis of our values, of our social and economic system, and of leadership. That also was referred to in some of the contributions. We did touch upon subjects like military capabilities of NATO and the security alliance between the US and Europe, and I think we have all agreed. So, on the question whether the glass is half full or half empty, I think the majority of the speakers would prefer the former interpretation. Europe has not lost its strategic weight, but is having some problems in translating its vision into action and to harness the capacity of how we might best use the novel European model of government, the postmodern governance that we are so proud of. So all in all, I will leave this discussion much reassured. On the $64,000 question of whether euro is salvageable, I think Lord Mandelson proved that he's not just a politician but a great diplomat. So I think the jury is out on that. But as I said, I will leave this discussion much reassured. unless, of course, the previous two panels were a form of therapy designed to make us feel better. Either way, I wish you a very good evening.
Thank you, sir.